Today, we are starting a new sermon series that I've titled simply Acceptance. It'll take you about 30 minutes today to figure out why I named it that, but stay tuned. We'll get to that word eventually. It's a fall series. Fall is a time of contemplation. It's a time, I don't know why it is, maybe it's the weather. You can sit on your back porch, it's not as hot outside, and the leaves start changing, and you have a little time, I hope, to think deep thoughts. Not hard thoughts, not complicated thoughts, deep thoughts. To think about your life and what it's about and what it means. To pause for just a moment in between the frantic pursuit of modern life and to wonder what your life is about. It is very easy, especially for the modern person, to be so frantically, hectically busy that we're always in motion, but never actually asking what that motion is for. This became especially apparent after the Industrial Revolution, where the modern man starts to go to work in a factory, and efficiency is the gold standard for modern life. Can you be efficient? Can you be productive? Can you get things done? So you go to the factory and you get to work and you start doing things, and you're constantly in motion. But you don't necessarily see any result of that. If you're on an assembly line and you're the second level widget maker, you know, you have a job, you do a little thing, you do a part, and then it moves on down the line, and you never even see what it becomes. You just know you did your part and you did it all day, and you made enough to maybe take care of your family, and you're content with that, you hope, except maybe you're not. There were many philosophers at that period of time, in the 1800s in particular, who began to ask, why is it like this? Why does it seem like we're always in motion and yet never really satisfied with what we're doing? One was Henry David Thoreau, who wrote a little text called Walden in 1854. And the story is, if you take his word for it, he's sitting out by Walden Pond in the fall, looking at life and the mystery of seasonal change, and he's trying to consider in this moment of solitude and quiet what matters and what doesn't. And in that, he has a discussion about kind of the frantic search for meaning in modern life. And there's a sentence in it that I'll share today that has been quoted so many times. It's the sentence everybody knows from Walden if you know anything about Walden. You may not, I haven't read all of it. I know this quote, I've read some of it. This quote is the one that gets repeated out of Walden, even if you never do the rest. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's pretty grim. And his thought was that when I look at people today, in particular men, he says, I look out and I see men, and they're quiet, maybe even stoic, they're reserved, they're restrained, but inside is this desperate, frantic need for meaning and contentment that they never find. Always in motion, never rewarded for that in a way that they could hang their hat on. There's this constant sense of desperation. He was speaking in particular of men. I'll say this is my disclaimer today. I can only speak of this as a man speaks of it. I can tell you how I feel, and I think I might be in common with a lot of men. Ladies, I suspect there is a counterpart to this in a woman's life. I don't know what it is, never been a woman, so I can't express exactly what that's like. You have to do your own job today interpreting this sermon for you. But I can say for a lot of men, you hear that quote, and every time I've shared that quote with a man, they go, yeah, right. There's like this sense of, yeah, that's exactly it. That modern life is just this long, long walk of quiet desperation, and never really feeling like we get to where we're going. Part of that's because we've been trained to think in terms of goals and achievement. That your life will have meaning when you do fill in the blank. I will be satisfied when I, and then you pick a goal, an achievement, an accomplishment, a product, whatever it is. And when I get there, then I'll finally be happy. And that's how you tell yourself to endure whatever you're going through. If you're working really hard and things are tough, or if you just can't find meaning in what you're doing and it seems trivial and shallow and pointless, you say, that's okay. I don't have to get any enjoyment or satisfaction or meaning out of what I'm doing right now because I'm working towards it. And one of these days I'll get there. And then what do you tell yourself? When I get there, then I'll be happy and I'll be satisfied. And so we're always looking for that next thing and telling ourselves we'll get there. How is that working out for us? Have you ever accomplished a goal? I don't know. Like, have you ever gotten close? Like one or two? Right? Somewhere in life you had something you really worked for and then you got there. At the end, did you find contentment and blissful satisfaction? Finished my dissertation and got my PhD a couple years ago. Boy, it was a long journey. I've been talking about it for years, and then you enroll, and then they give you lots of busy work you don't want to do, but you do it because I'm going to get my PhD. And then you write this massive 200, 300-page document with footnotes no one will ever read, and you put it out there, and you get it done, and then you sit in a room, and some guys judge you for your work, and you get done, and they shake your hand and say, Dr. Williams. And you go, oh, right, that's pretty good. And I convinced myself that it would all be worth it, and I would find deep and meaningful satisfaction when I was done. And they send you a nice piece of paper and have a little ceremony for you, and you hang it on your wall, and you step back and say, there it is. If you'd like to come see mine, it's in my office. It's got a really nice frame. And then for a moment, I'll admit, there was a moment or two of satisfaction. Like there was a moment where it's like, yeah, I did that. I'm pretty great. I felt really good. And it lasted about that long. And can I tell you, I'll just share this personally. What followed the end of my dissertation was depression. Because I had been so singly minded, focused on one thing, and then I didn't have that thing anymore. And after years of pursuing that, I got done. And I got depressed, meaningfully, dangerously depressed for a while, because I thought, what am I doing now? I'm supposed to be happy. And I messaged a friend of mine, my friend Cole, who had just 6 months earlier got done with his. I said, do you feel weird? He goes, depressed. He says, he said, Google it. And sure enough, I did. There are some fascinating statistics correlating PhDs and immediate onset of depression. Like that guys get done and then they immediately are like, well, now what am I doing? What happens is you meet your goal and you've told yourself, when I do that, then I'll be satisfied, and you're not. And so the opposite conclusion sets in. I will never be satisfied. If that didn't do it, nothing will. I mean, you have two choices. Either you go back and repeat, I need a better goal, and I'll work towards that, and that one will make me happy. And just ignore the fact that no goal you've ever met has ever made you happy. You ignore it, and you go set another one, and you keep going, rinse and repeat, right? Or you have that look in the mirror and say, nothing will ever make me happy, which might be worse. Quiet desperation. I'm a fan of the music of the Broadway musical Hamilton. I don't know if it's even remotely historical accurate, but it's fun to listen to. And in that, it tells the story. It portrays a version of the life of founding father Alexander Hamilton, who's an orphan and an immigrant, and he just fights and claws his way up to the top. He's going to do it all, right? And everything he does, he works harder than anybody else. He's harder working than anybody else. The songs in the musical are stuff like nonstop, right? He never quits. He gets together his friend James Madison and John Jay. They weren't really friends, but he gets them together and he says, we're going to write articles explaining the U.S. Constitution. We're going to call them the Federalist Papers. We're going to put them out here and people are going to be impressed with them. John Jay writes 5. James Madison writes 25. Alexander Hamilton writes 51, right? Nonstop. Never quits. Always in. But the best song in the musical is the song title and lyric that says, I will never be satisfied. I will never be satisfied, repeated throughout as this haunting lyric. That the thing we think is a virtue, his drive, his ambition, his commitment to his goal, has a consequence. It's a man who can never be made happy with anything he does. So those are your choices. That's today's sermon. See you next week. I'll give you two choices. You can decide, this is what modern life gives us. You can frantically pursue some goal or ambition, and you can keep telling yourself you'll be happy when you get there and you can put up with the rest. Or you can fall into despair with the rest of us and say, nothing will ever make me happy. Turns out it's not a new question. I said it was modern man's problem, and we got a special dose of it in modern life, but it turns out to be a really old question. This sermon series has come from various chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes, one of my favorites. And he asked this question in chapter 3, verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? That's our question, right? What do I get out of this? Where's the meaning? Where's the satisfaction? What do I get from doing the thing set in front of me? And he pursues this question in a way that I think is actually helpful. He says, I have seen, this is 10 and 11 of that chapter, I have seen the busyness that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The first bit really hits home. I have seen the business, or quite literally, the busyness that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Everybody know what the expression busy work means? When you're in school and there's 30 minutes left in the class and the teacher doesn't want you to be loud, but they're kind of done teaching you for the day. And so what do? It's coloring sheet time, right? I had a geography teacher. He was a good geography teacher. He did fine. I learned some geography. I know where the map goes, right? But his solution to pretty much every class every week was, and now here's a map for you to color. This was in high school, right? This is in high school. And if you questioned him about it, he said, well, my philosophy is, if you spend 30 minutes coloring in a map of Tanzania, you'll remember where it is. Doesn't work. I still can't find Tanzania, except I know what continent it's on. But what did it feel like? It felt like busy work. It felt like you're giving me something to do so that I'll have something to do. It doesn't feel like this accomplishes anything. I've been teaching this last 2 weeks on the book of Leviticus to the Ukrainian Bible Institute students early in the morning, Zoom call teaching. And every so often, I'll be deep in the weeds of some concept in Leviticus, and one of the nice Ukrainian students will ask the question every teacher hates, is this going to be on the test? And I say, well, not specifically, and all the pencils go down. Right? Then we know the difference between something that really has consequence and busy work. The author, the teacher, he calls himself, Kohelet in the Hebrew, the teacher of the text of Ecclesiastes, which we think may be somebody like Solomon, says, yeah, I've seen the busy work. I've seen what God has given you to do. What do you think about it? What do you do with it? God has made everything beautiful in its time. First thing he points out is we have to recognize that every season of life, they're not all the same. Let's just start there. Every season of life is different. What you're doing right now is not what you've always done. It feels like it. And what you're doing right now is not the only thing you'll ever do. And it feels like it. But it's neither. And every season of life, every task you find that God has given you to do has its own little bit of beauty if you look for it. That's the first step in getting past the quiet desperation, is to stop thinking about where is this leading and getting in a hurry to get there. It's to pause and look at where you are and say, what is beautiful about this? I was joking last week. I gave my story about journey before destination. You have to take the journey before the trip ends. You can't get there until you've gone down the road. And we were laughing about, how much I hate driving through Kansas. You know what makes Kansas a better thing to drive through? Enjoying it instead of being cynical. Like if I'm driving through Kansas and all I'm thinking is these aren't mountains, I'm pretty miserable. Because they're not, right? If you're only going to be happy when you get to the end of the road, Kansas is a long state to drive through. But if you can take a moment and say, amber waves of grain and things like, if you look around and say, look at what there is, If you can enjoy it, then you end up enjoying it. Or at the very least, you look in the back seat and you say, hey, my kids are along for the ride. This is pretty good. Now, there's something worth beauty in every season of life. But also he says, you have to accept that you don't get to see how it all plays out. God has put a little eternity or obscurity or spirituality in the human life, but not so much that you get to see the whole story from beginning to end. The reason we think things are busy work is because we don't know what good they accomplish. If you think it accomplishes nothing, then you say this is a waste of time. And if you don't know what it accomplishes, then you assume that it accomplishes nothing, and you decide this is a waste of time. So humans are the worst about looking at something, and because we can't see why it would be that way, we say this is a waste of time. The teacher of Ecclesiastes said, hey, no season of life is the whole story. And you may not get told before, during, or after what the point of that was. And so you're going to have to accept that this season of life, you either trust God to have given you something of value or not. You have to accept that that challenge is something God wanted you to have or not. No season of life is the whole story, but every season has something in it that is beautiful. I perceived there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. How do you become satisfied and escape the silent and quiet desperation? He says you got to take a look at what you're doing and enjoy it. Isn't that terrible advice? How do you get happier? Being happy. Well, that's no good. But there's something about that really has some value when you think about it. He says you have to be willing to accept the fact that the thing you're doing right now is the thing God gave you to do right now, and it's a gift. And even if I don't know what it results in or how it works out, that there's something to it that I need to accept for its own sake. He has that line in there, which is frequently misquoted and misunderstood, where he says, eat, drink, and be merry. Well, that's not what he says, by the way. That's what the rich man says in the parable of the rich fool in the New Testament. He says, I'll tear down my barns and build better, and then I'll eat, drink, and be merry. He's got a goal, and he says, I'm going to get rich, and I'm going to get richer, and I'm going to get richer, and then I'll be happy, eat, drink, and be merry. That is not what this text says. He says, yeah, eat and enjoy yourself. Catch the rest of that sentence. He doesn't say the goal of life is pleasure. He's not a hedonist. He's not saying just go do whatever makes you happy. What he says is take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Toil, the work itself, not the result, not the outcome, not the retirement, not the goal you set for yourself. That's not the gift of God. That if you do these things, eventually something good happens. He says the thing you are doing right now is pleasurable. You can decide that this thing you're doing right now has value, that work can be its own gift, that struggle and challenge can have meaning all on its own apart from whatever it results in. You can have pleasure in the task and accept that all on its own, not as a means to an end, but as an end itself, that it is itself the gift of God to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before Him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Why does He put that sentence there at the end? It's the reminder to us, again, that we think we're in charge of the story and we're in charge of our destiny and we've set these goals and we are going to change human history, or at the very least our lives. We're going to create some kind of outcome that we want that's going to make us happy, or we're going to leave some kind of legacy for our children that will be meaningful and valuable, and then we'll be able to say at the end of days, Ben lived a good life and I can be happy. And Solomon says, or you could remember that God's in charge anyway. If God does it, it lasts. If you do, it probably doesn't. All of your accomplishments fade. And I don't even think he says that in a cynical way. There's a way to read Solomon where he's really cynical if you're not careful, right? Where you say, and everything you do dies and passes into dust. And you say, well, what am I bother with? That sounds like where I started, with despair. But instead, I don't think he's saying that. He's saying it's actually kind of comforting to accept the fact you have less control over the universe than you thought. It's not all up to you. If it was, it would crush you with the weight of that responsibility, which again is where that desperation comes from. You think if I don't do that thing that changes everything, then nothing good happens. It's all up to me. And Solomon says, it's not quite as much up to you as you think. If God wants something back, he goes and gets it. If he wants something to last, he makes it last. If he wants to go away, it goes away. Ultimately, we have to give up the idea that your achievements will change everything. I don't think you have to say my achievements change nothing, but they don't accomplish everything. Far from it. Only what God wills endures forever. There's an old prayer. I remember we would have lunch at the Hembree's house in St. Louis, Oklahoma, when my dad preached there when I was a very small boy, and we'd go to their house for lunch after worship. And in their house, they had one of these decorative plates, and on that plate was a prayer. And I remember it because I thought it was a very silly prayer. You've probably heard it before. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I remember thinking as a young man, how silly is that? I can change it all. Turns out, as you age, that prayer gets smarter all the time. And it's starting to sneak up on me a little bit. I don't know if you know this or not, that prayer actually came from America's most notable theologian, homegrown theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr. He was writing it during World War II. And it was a prayer in the midst of global war and uncertain outcomes. And he said, we're going to have to accept there are some things we can't change and there are some things we can, and we're going to have to learn the difference. And it's that word accept that's the challenge. That ultimately this is going to play out the way God says. Do I accept that, or do I still believe it entirely depends on me? Chapter 5, he picks up the same theme in Ecclesiastes. Only this time he gives you a specific example, and it's money. Easy to pick on money, so he does. But remember, this can apply to anything. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor is he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eye? Again, kind of grim and cynical. As goods increase, so do those who eat them. Congratulations. The more you make, the more people need stuff that you made. That's cynical, but it's kind of true. I thought if my income increased, I would have more income. It turns out my children just get hungrier. I have to. And where does it all go? It goes to Walmart and the grocery store. That's where it goes. And he says, what do you have? I like that last line. What advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Have you ever bought something that you saved for and that you were convinced was going to change your life forever, and then you set it wherever it goes and you look at it and you think, well, there it is. And it doesn't like immediately glow with waves of happiness coming off of it. It just sits there and you say, well, that's the thing. When your life is about possessions, you can set them on your trophy case and say, there it is. And you get to look at it. Kohelet says, wealth works like that. And this is the darkest sentiment of all. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. This is God's promise. Absolute promise, and it applies to anything. If you decide something other than God himself is, and what he's given you to do, is going to be the meaning of your life, this is God's promise. He will not allow it to make you happy. The creator of the universe gives you this absolute promise. If you pick a goal and convince yourself that will satisfy me, he will not let it. Until we rest in him, we rest not at all. None of those goals will ever make us happy. Wealth won't make you happy, and whatever else you fill the blank in with. Instead, what does he say? It's vanity. Vanity is one of these great words in Ecclesiastes. It comes from the Hebrew word hevel or havel, depending on who taught you Hebrew. But the translation is hard to get right because it's a tough word. But it means something like steam or smoke or wind. And I like smoke as a metaphor. All is vanity, all is smoke. What do we know about smoke? Think about smoke for just a minute. Is smoke a real thing? Yeah. It's a real thing. You can have so much smoke in a room you can't see through it. You walk into a whole bunch of smoke that burns your eyes. Smoke is so real, it can choke you and suffocate your lungs. And you see it and say, there it is, it's smoke. Ever tried to grab any? I mean, you can see it, and you just think, if I just reach out my hand, I can get a handful of smoke, and you get nothing. And that's the word he uses to describe these man-made goals. Is wealth a real thing? Yeah, I mean, I see it. I can see it in other people's bank. Once in a while, I can see it in mine. I can see what wealth looks like. Have you ever tried to grab it? And just smoke. You can't hold on to it. And so are the goals and aspirations of mortal life. It's why we're constantly in this quiet desperation, because we keep grabbing for things and we can see them and they're just right out there and we reach and they're nothing. Such are the goals and deceptions of our own mind. Instead, he says in verse 12, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. The rich man has all he wants and can't get to sleep because he will never be satisfied with that goal. He says that the laborer can go to bed hungry and still sleep just fine. What is he talking about? That there is a way to live a life content with the labor and task that you've been given, which is not dependent on the outcome. The laborer did a good day's work, and he finds a way to be happy with that, whether it resulted in something in his bank account or not. The work itself was its reward, and he went to bed that night knowing it. He considered the ability to live, to do a task, to work, to be challenged, as itself a reward and a gift that gave his life meaning and purpose. As he came from his mother's womb, so shall he go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go, and what gain is there to him who toils for the wind, the hevel, smoke? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness and much vexation and sickness and anger. He says, you want to be miserable? I'll tell you how to do it. Make smoke and wind your objective in life. Try to grab it. Set yourself a goal that cannot possibly make you happy. In fact, here's a certainty. Set yourself a goal that will certainly make you miserable, and I can tell you how that will work out. Don't let your happiness depend on things that will certainly make you miserable. Instead, he says you have to find a way to be satisfied outside of the goal. The process, the journey itself has to have value. And here's the great bit he repeats from chapter 3. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. What's the gift of God? Wealth? He says, no, that's a deception. That's smoke. The work was the gift. Find enjoyment in the toil, in the task itself. Find your meaning in living, not in hope that you're trading your life for something later on. Make the task itself your joy. Accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. Surrender to the idea that God is in control and accept that this is what God has given you to do, and it is good all on its own. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Can you remember, or let me say that, can you imagine living a life so full of joy when you got to the end you couldn't remember the bad times? Most of us are doing the opposite. We are so intently focused on dissatisfaction that we cannot remember a good thing God has done for us. And in misery, quiet desperation. Solomon says there's an alternative. You can be happy with the journey itself. You can be satisfied with the work God has given you to do. And if you're happy every day and satisfied every day with what God gave you to do that day, you get to the end and you have lived a life so full of joy you can't remember the other stuff anyway. Can you imagine a life like that? A life so joyful you can't remember worry? I think I'd like that. But it comes at the price, it's a small price, of accepting that what God has given you to do is its own gift. For the Christian, I think we have to learn this lesson. Give up the idea, I will be satisfied when whatever happens. Give up the idea that I'll never be satisfied. We don't have to despair. And accept the toil itself that God has given us to do. Jesus was asked a question in John chapter 6. They said to him, "What must we do to be doing the works of God? What great thing have you set in front of us? What accomplishment do we need to get so that we know God will love us and that we'll deserve His favor and His love? What can we do to get God's attention? What can we do to do something of meaning in our life? What must we do to be doing the works of God?" Do you remember His answer? This is the work of God, that you believe in Him who He has sent. The great work that God has given you is to accept that God is in control of this story, that you are not here to earn His love or to merit His forgiveness, but to trust and believe in His Son, Jesus Christ, and that the greatest things to happen in this universe weren't up to you. They would be accomplished and have been accomplished by God Himself. Your task is the simple beauty of daily faith in God and whatever task He sets in front of you. That's the work that God has sent us to do. If you would accept today that task of faith, of trust, and to turn to God, putting on this new life of actual satisfaction in His Son instead of perpetual disappointment, I'd encourage you to do it today. As we stand and as we sing, you may come.